thank you to our two distinguished guests for what could not be a more timely dialogue. And if I can go on the basis of ladies first, to the UK Foreign Secretary, and just ask you to reflect on the conventional wisdom in sections of the UK think tank scene and in sections of the UK media, that the crisis in Ukraine proves that we need to rebalance our foreign national security policy back to Europe, that the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, that the terms of the integrated review have been invalidated by recent events, and we need supposedly to come to back to our common European home, and that we don't have the bandwidth to, as Lyndon Johnson once said of Gerald Ford, walk and chew gum at the same time.
Well, first of all, it's fantastic to be here in India at the Future Forum. And the fact I'm here for the third time in just over a year, I think demonstrates the United Kingdom's commitment to the Indo-Pacific, to our relationship with India. And I think strengthening the relationship with India is more important than it has ever been, precisely because we are living in a more insecure world, precisely because we have seen Putin's appalling invasion of Ukraine and violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and the shattering of European security. And of course, it's vitally important for freedom and democracy in Europe that we challenge Putin and we ensure that he loses in Ukraine. But we also need to think more widely about the message it would send across the globe if Putin was successful. If he was able to have success invading a sovereign nation, what message would that send to other aggressors around the world? And I think it's very significant in the sanctions that have been applied on Russia, along with the weapons that are being supplied to Ukraine in their fight for freedom, is that we are seeing an alliance of the G7, including Japan, putting on sanctions. And we're also seeing countries like Australia, South Korea, and Singapore participate in those sanctions, because I think countries across the world, regardless of their specific status or structure, understand there is a fundamental problem if an aggressor can get away with invading a sovereign nation. And that does violate international law, it violates the UN Charter. And the idea that somehow we should only focus on Europe because of this crisis is completely wrong. I'm afraid to say the implications of this crisis are far-reaching. We are seeing global food security threatened. We're seeing global energy security threatened. If we look at the people who are in Ukraine, and I pay tribute to the work India has done to secure the release of its students from Ukraine. We had citizens from all parts of the globe living in Ukraine, a sovereign democracy. So this, to me, highlights the need for like-minded nations to work together. This highlights the need for us to work more closely with India on strengthening our economic ties, strengthening our security ties, and strengthening our defence ties, because we can't afford not to.
Thank you. And just specifically on the integrated review, why the current crisis reaffirms the need for the integrated review?
Well, the integrated review was very clear that Russia remained the number one security threat. So the integrated review recognised that. And in fact, the United Kingdom, alongside the United States, were absolutely crucial in highlighting the threat that Russia posed to Ukraine. We unveiled intelligence before the invasion, showing that that was exactly what Putin planned. We put in place statements that were clear that there would be severe costs of an invasion by Putin. So we have always been aware of the threat from Russia. I think it's certainly true post-Cold War that the West didn't spend enough on defense, that we were complacent in allowing Russia to, first of all, invade Crimea and then allow the actions that they undertook in the Donbass region as well. So there were certainly failings to do enough early on, but that certainly doesn't mean that we don't face other threats. And the G7 also pointed to the economic coercion that we're seeing from China and the threats in the Indo-Pacific region. And this is why, alongside our work with India, alongside our work with Japan, that AUKUS is very important in protecting an open and free Indo-Pacific. So simply because one threat is very real and very present doesn't mean we can ignore other threats which might be slightly in the longer term, but certainly pose a risk to global security.
Thank you. And Dr. Jaishankar, welcome again to a shared policy exchange platform. We were only sorry not to see you in person in London on one of your recent visits there. But just thinking about my question to Liz Truss about conventional wisdom, and one particular bit of conventional wisdom that's, of course, been overturned in recent months has been the idea that Europe would be the least likely place that a nuclear war or chemical weapons attack might take place. We all thought about the Middle East, all kinds of other places where it might take place, but not Europe. How the world, from your perspective, has changed since the Ukraine crisis began?
Well, I think the world's changed in many ways. Obviously, one part of it is the conflict in Ukraine itself, the politics of the conflict, what it has done in terms of challenges for diplomacy and policies of various countries. We in India had a particular immediate concern, which was we had about 22,000 students there. Getting them out safely was quite a challenge. And a lot of Ukraine's neighbors were extremely helpful to us in that process. And that's now largely behind us. I think the real problems are still to come, certainly for our part of the world. We are seeing the impact of the conflict on energy prices, on commodities. There would be other disruptions. If the financial world is disrupted and the logistics world is disrupted, and the markets are in a turmoil, I mean, all of this is going to have consequences in the rest of the world, and I think we're seeing that.
And when you look at the way in which President Biden has characterized the new era, he talked about a new world order, which the US will lead. He's also talked about the world more clearly polarized between authoritarianism and democracy. I wonder what your thoughts are on how he's couched the current international situation.
Well, look, I think all of us are entitled to our perspectives and our particular analysis because, in truth, we look at the world from our particular vantage point. If I were to step back and, reflect on the world order, the fact is the world order is not it's not a sudden shift. I mean, it's something which is happening at one level continuously and progressively. And one part of the changing world order is really an enormous economic rebalancing which has taken place over the last 30, 40 years, which has translated into a much more multipolar world. And if I were to give you a sort of shorthand formulation for that, the fact that in a way the G7, the centrality of the G7 has been replaced, not exactly identically, but by the G20. So there's a much broader spread of countries who have views and influence on how the world should run. But the world order also changes from specific events and processes. I think the world order changed, for example, from our vantage point by what happened in Afghanistan last year. I think the world order is changing partly due to the consequences of the rise of China and the policies which China has followed, particularly with its neighbors. It has changed also due to frictions which are there between major powers. And I think the full impact of what has happened, what is happening in Ukraine, and what have been the reactions, responses to that, I think that's still very much unfolding. So it's a set of shocks, you could say, which would supplement a longer trend. And that's really, to my mind, will produce a different world order.
You've got a new edition of your book, The India Way, coming out, and you've talked about one trend.
A paperback version, yes.
One trend, 4 shocks. Would you go into all of you mentioned some of the shocks already, but would you?
Well, that's exactly, I mean, that's unconsciously what was in my mind. I mean, to me, rebalancing and multipolarity has been the trend. And in the last 2-3 years, COVID has been a big shock. Afghanistan has been a shock. Ukraine is now the new shock. And as I said, to a degree, especially the US-China relationship has its impact.
And in one of the chapters there in your book called Mandarins and Masses, you talked about the need for politicians to take account of public opinion. I'm just wondering...
also for diplomats to take into account.
Very, very much so. And reinforces that point is that as Stalin used to say, how many divisions does the Pope have? But of course, it didn't take account his comments of the moral suasion, the moral impact, and so on. I'm just thinking of the moral impact now in terms of British opinion, for example, but not just British opinion, of events in Ukraine, how much we all need to take more account of that dimension of the sort of new international morality through social media and all kinds of other mechanisms.
Well, the Pope answered Stalin's question with a gap of about 40 years. So the influence of the Pope was actually felt in the 1980s. So about in terms of the moral factor, I think there is, particularly in a more connected world, it definitely public sentiment expresses itself much more strongly. But if I were to sort of give you a global reading, I would say some of it also depends on proximity. Some of it depends on how strongly a particular country or society relates to what is happening. And again, the example I would use is Afghanistan. I think what we saw happening in Afghanistan last summer had a very, very strong impact, certainly in India. I probably would say it didn't have the same impact in Europe. I think people didn't necessarily relate to the coming of the Taliban the same way. They didn't identify with the people who were affected in the same way. So, the truth is that many of us have similar or shared beliefs, values, but there is that ability to relate, the ability to identify. Some of it is proximity. That's also a factor. So I think you get a slightly, the intensity of the reaction may not be the same all over the world to the same event.
Foreign Secretary, your thoughts?
Well, what I think the crisis in Russia or crisis in Ukraine has demonstrated is the resilience of democracy and of free people, because I remember during the COVID crisis, there was a lot of commentary that actually authoritarian regimes, because they are better at imposing order on society, were doing a better job at dealing with the pandemic. There was a view that younger generations, even in democracies like Britain and the United States, were turning against democracy, and they wanted, a stronger sort of push, a stronger leader. What we are seeing, first of all, through the response of the Ukrainians and the brave people of Ukraine fighting for their country that they really believe in, and the freedom to speak out and the freedom to communicate, is proving much more effective than Russians who have been asked to fight in a war for reasons they don't know why, in a way that they weren't told about. And we've also seen a huge response from democratic societies and indeed resistance in Russia. People being prepared to demonstrate in Russia against what is happening. So I think it has shown the resilience of free societies and the importance of being able to speak freely, the importance of being able to select your own government, and the fact that NATO has stood up, the G7 has stood up, and the West has really stood up in a way that we haven't seen for some years. And I think that is a significant development. I mean, I do agree with what Jai is saying about proximity, but also the specific historical responsibilities countries have. So I feel the UK is very responsible because we are a signatory to the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, that in exchange for giving up its nuclear weapons, we agreed that Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be guaranteed. And that is something that we were the first European country to recognize Ukraine's independence. And we have followed through with that by being the first European country to donate weapons to Ukraine. But I think we feel very strongly a sense of responsibility. And also, I was growing up in the time the Berlin Wall fell, and a great delight and excitement and a feeling that this freedom that had been brought to Eastern Europe was going to last forever. And we have made mistakes subsequently, but I think people feel that very, very strongly in the United Kingdom as a country who was very much in support of Eastern Europe being able to have that freedom. The idea that clock has shifted back really, really affects people at quite a deep level.
And moving on from the core intrinsic issues around what's going on in Ukraine, what do you assess as the impact of Russia's present difficulties in Ukraine on the perceptions of China about how she might behave in the international order now, a small country grinding down a much larger military, for example, successfully?
Well, I've spoken to my Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi. China is clear that it respects Ukraine's sovereignty. And that is an important principle that as a member of the P5 and a responsible nation, China needs to stick to. And therefore, we shouldn't see China supporting Russia's actions in Ukraine. And I do think the strong response by NATO, the strong response by the G7 and our friends and allies around the world will make other aggressors think twice about carrying out invasions on sovereign nations. I mean, that is the message that has been sent. But I also think it's important that we're not complacent. Civilians in Ukraine are still being attacked, and it's important that we double down on the sanctions. The UK wants to see more sanctions put in place on banks, on the ability for Russia to use gold, closing access to ports for all vessels around Europe and the Americas, and also tackling the dependency on Russian oil and gas, because ultimately it's oil and gas that is funding Putin's war machine, and we need to cut off reliance on that, and we need a timetable to end reliance on Russian oil and gas. So we need to do more, and we can't be complacent just because the brave Ukrainians have done a very, very good job at pushing back against Russian aggression. This is not over yet, and it is very important that the free world continues to lean in.
Dr. Jaishankar, the impact in your assessment on China of the latest Ukraine crisis and how it might possibly bring about more British-Indian cooperation in the Indo-Pacific?
We had Mr. Wang Yi here about a week ago. Obviously, we discussed the Ukraine situation. We also discussed our own relationship, which is not exactly going through its best period. But the Chinese had their view, their analysis of what was happening in Ukraine. I think the bit that we did agree upon was that there was a need for an urgent ceasefire, that there was a need to return to diplomacy, to dialogue. Now, beyond that, what conclusions they have drawn, or how this has shaped their thinking, I could speculate as much as you could, but I'm not sure I should on the stage. But on the Indo-British cooperation, I think we have a logic which is of a relationship between us. I don't think it is necessarily a logic that is limited or which is directed at some other country. So I would say quite autonomous of what China or any other country may be doing. I mean, there are plenty of things for us to work on, and a large part of what we have been doing for the last year has been really to take our relationship, look at it in a much more contemporary way, take into account all the changes, really the big changes which have taken place in both countries. In the case of UK, the Brexit and all the policies that have followed. In our case, I would say the growth of India, the broadening of our vision and interests, and also the fact that today our business is more, we are big investors in each other's economies. The importance of mobility, of talent flow is much more between us. I think the COVID has brought home to us again the importance of working together in areas like health and science. So there's a lot that we have going for each other. I quite understand that there is we tend to see relationships in terms of a larger context, but I do suggest that there is great merit in this one.
And obviously, here to discuss the strategic cyber relationship between the two countries during the Foreign Secretary's visit and the signing of that. But just could you go in a little more detail on the most promising areas of cooperation in security affairs, defense included?
Well, again, we have, I think, clearly convergences. We are trying to see how those convergences develop into more shared interests. If you were to look at the defense side, again, there's a long history we have, but our defense trade hasn't been big in recent years. In fact, what I did share with Foreign Secretary Truss was the thinking in India about defense. The fact that today there's an emphasis in what we call Make in India, and therefore the more collaborative we are, the possibilities of working together are more. Also that we do a lot of global sourcing, so it's important that any offer be competitive. And again, the interest in co-creating is very strong in certain areas. So a lot of what we aspire to lies ahead of us. And our job right now is to make sure that the policies are in place so that the people who actually do things in particular verticals are not obstructed by policy from doing those things.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary.
Well, I would very much term this as a positive agenda about a closer relationship between the UK and India that is going to help make both of our countries safer, and more resilient. And I think we've all reflected in the wake of the COVID crisis, and indeed with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how important it is to have security in your supply chains, to not be dependent on a single supplier, to not be dependent on coercive authoritarian regimes. And I think we're looking in the UK about how do we make sure we're protecting our critical minerals, our technology, our energy supplies. And these are the same questions that other countries are asking. And I think there is so much more we can be doing with India on technology. We both lead in areas like number of unicorns, number of people involved in the tech industry. India is a tech powerhouse. There is more we can do there. Helping to set standards in areas like artificial intelligence as two freedom-loving democracies will help lead the world in that direction. Trade, we're in the middle of negotiations of a free trade deal. I think we can get that completed pretty rapidly. And again, that's another opportunity. Jai's talked about defence. Again, I think there's an opportunity there for us to work closely with India, including Indian production of key pieces of defence equipment that ensure greater security, but also help share technology and IP and technology transfer. So these are all areas where, to be frank, I don't think we've done enough in the past. I don't think we've operated to our maximum potential. And I think a strong India and a strong United Kingdom and a strong partnership between India and the United Kingdom isn't just good for us. I think it's good for the world, because I think the things that we do are positive and make a positive contribution. So I think it's fair to say that Dr. Jaishankar and I have been going through the details. I think we're having a further meeting after this session to really work out the nuts and bolts of how we make progress.
Can I just add a word here? I think in a way, the experience of the COVID has also made the world much more conscious about being, I don't want to use the word self-sufficient, but certainly having more national capabilities. Because the kind of disruptions that we saw during the COVID period, it's really brought home to many economies how vulnerable they were. In a way, you could say the last 20 years of globalization, it's not going to be reversed, but there will be a correction to it. I think the world was much too obsessed with a just-in-time economic outlook, where you were absolutely sure that distant locations would deliver on timelines that you need. And I think these multiple conflicts or obstructions to connectivity or these big uncertainties like COVID have caused people to pause on those assumptions. So you will see the world go in a somewhat different direction. Different countries would express it differently. But I think you're seeing that shifting of gears take place.
I think that's absolutely right. And if we look at what's happened in Europe, we prioritize cheap goods and cheap energy and cheap technology over long-term security and freedom. That's the reality of the decisions we made. And when we are looking at trading partners now, when we're looking at developing deep technology relationships, and one of the areas where we're collaborating much more is on cyber, we are now much more conscious about who can we trust? Who can we trust? Whose regulations and laws can we trust? Whose future direction can we trust? Is that a stable country whose values we share that we are doing business with? And this is why India is, as far as we're concerned, a key partner for the United Kingdom, because we do trust India and we can do business with India. And of course, there are some capabilities which we as the United Kingdom, want to retain domestically. This is why we put in a new investment screening law to make sure we're protecting essential technology, essential capabilities. But where we are not able to do everything, or where it's not desirable in the UK, we can't do everything and produce anything. We have to be working with trusted friends, and we have to have our diversity of supply. So that is why the work we're already doing on the 2030 roadmap, I think, has become even more important in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Those relationships of trust are more important than they've ever been.
There's a word for it called trust shoring, like offshoring.
Very good. I think we've some time for questions from the floor. I'm afraid because the dazzling lights are so brilliant, I can't necessarily see who it is. I think, if I may interject a policy exchange house rule here, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. Who do I see first question? I can see just in the front row the outline of my good friend Lord Billamoria, who, of course, president of the CBI and King of Cobra Beer, if I can so describe you.
Thank you, my lord. Dean, first of all, full credit to you and Policy Exchange in being ahead of the game with the Indo-Pacific. As a proud Indian, Asia-Pacific no longer exists. It's now the Indo-Pacific. And the integrated review, which was a great move by the government with the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. Now, Foreign Secretary, you mentioned trust. And Minister Jaishankar, you spoke about logic. And trust has been described as authenticity, logic, and empathy. And I think there's phenomenal trust between our two countries. Why not seize this moment when we're in the middle of a free trade agreement, when, as Minister Jaishankar, you spoke about trade, Foreign Secretary, you spoke about technology. Why don't we work closer together? Because trade and security go hand in hand. And you spoke about, Minister Jaishankar, about the future, what we aspire to is in the future. Can I suggest two things we can aspire to? One, why doesn't the UK join Quad? Wouldn't that be great to have that defense alliance if we join Quad? Secondly, we have 2+2 meetings that India has with other countries. Why don't we have a 2+2? And I'll go one step further. Why don't we have a 3+3 where we introduce the business ministers and defense ministers and foreign secretaries of both countries?
And I think our Policy Exchange's chair of trustees and former Australian Foreign Minister Alexander Downer just WhatsApp with exactly that question. So it's two of you, in fact, asking the question. Dr. Jaishankar first.
I think on the 2+2, look, my understanding of the 2+2, we do 2+2s at the ministerial level currently with the US, with Japan, now with Australia, with Russia. And mostly it is done when, the security side is strong enough and the security has a sufficiently significant place in the overall foreign policy. So you want the foreign ministers and defense ministers to be in the room at the same time. I could see something like that happening with the UK. I think the only reason probably it hasn't so far, maybe the security side hadn't come to the same level that the foreign policy side has. There are, by the way, countries with whom sometimes the trade and foreign ministers sit together. That also often makes sense. So I don't think we have particularly fixed ideas on that where the Indian side is concerned. We have to, see how the roadmap develops. But on the roadmap, though, I want to say that one I don't want to share with anybody. So that the foreign ministers are in charge. So we want to be very clear, who has the responsibility there. The Quad question, look, the thinking of the Quad was really 4 countries who are at 4 corners of the Indo-Pacific. So there was a sort of a geographical basis for what we're doing, quite apart from the shared values and the shared interests. So at the moment, because remember, the Quad's still sort of working its way through. In its current incarnation, it started just 4.5 years ago. It's gone through two upgrades, from a bureaucratic one to a political one, a ministerial one, and then to a head of government, head of state one. And my own sense is a lot of the focus of the Quad is in intensifying the Quad, making sure that there's a sort of a very substantive agenda. That's really been where the focus has been.
Foreign Secretary on the Quad and all the other range of suite of questions from Lord Billamore.
What I've discovered, I've now been Foreign Secretary for 6 months, and there is just an immense panoply of different formations that one can be part of, and certainly the UK is obviously part of the NATO grouping, the transatlantic Quad, the G7. We're also currently working to join the CPTPP, which I hope will be finished at the end of this year, as well as having a lot of direct 2+2 relationships. So we've recently done a 2+2 with Australia. I think the most important thing, though, is that we shouldn't allow the formats to get in the way of the delivery. And that is the most important thing for me, is that we're really cooperating with India much more closely on defense and security. We're sharing more intelligence. We're working together on cyber. We're working together on technology. We're working together on trade. I know that the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, is keen to visit India. I'm sure we're going to have more future discussions on this subject. But I think the most important thing is the what about how we go on with it. And Minister Jaishankar talked earlier about the sort of shifting geopolitics of the world. And we are at a huge inflection moment, in my view. The post-Cold War world has now come to a close, and we are entering a new era. And there is a proliferation of different groupings taking place. But I think they all point to the fact that the current architecture isn't working as it should, and we are finding coalitions of the willing and alliances to get things done. And certainly, as the United Kingdom, we see India as an absolutely crucial partner in that, alongside our other crucial allies.
Very good. Do I see any other questions from near the front? There was somebody who was trying to catch my eye. There was someone at the back. Name an organisation, please. There was somebody trying to catch my eye, waving their hand.
Good evening.
Can't hear you. I'm afraid you're going to have a superior mic or boom out loudly.
Hello.
Name an organisation, please.
My name's Sebastian Berger. I'm the South Asia Director for the international news agency AFP. Foreign Secretary Truss, I found it was interesting that you mentioned here, so you talked several times about Britain's historical responsibility towards Ukraine. And I was wondering, what do you feel are Britain's historical responsibilities towards India? And Minister Jaishankar, same question.
Well, the context in which I'm talking about Ukraine is the fact that we have an agreement dating back to 1994 to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And we need to do all we can within our powers to live by the commitment we made. And I do feel very, very strongly about that. I mean, in terms of our relationship with India, India is celebrating the anniversary of its independence this year. I am very determined that we have a forward-looking relationship with India that looks at the countries we are now, the values that we share, the aspirations that we have for our people, and that we seek to maximize those. And I think we have a very strong people-to-people relationship as well. And earlier on, we were talking about how strongly our populations feel about various issues. And certainly, India is a country that the UK has huge connections with. But I think our focus has to be on the future. It has to be on the potential. It has to be on where we want to be in the next 20 years. And where I want to be with India in the next 20 years is a much closer relationship. You know, much more close economically, much more close in terms of people links, and much more close in terms of our shared aspirations on security and defence, because, you know, we are both democracies. We are in a world that is increasingly insecure, and I believe we need to work together in that world.
I don't have too much to add to that, but I would only say where our relationship is concerned, a lot of people in this country are reflecting on it precisely because it's 75 years since we became independent. And obviously it's a complicated history. And it has its difficult bits, it has its connecting bits. But what we are trying to do today is really look ahead and see if we can forge a relationship that is more in keeping with our times, which build on, you know, what are the positive aspects of our past, and which also really serve the interests of both our countries and our people in what obviously is a much more complicated world.
Thank you. I'm trying to see other questions across.
There's a young lady there.
Yes.
Just right.
I can't see, but
She's
just
right.
straight in front. Maybe I'm overlooking the obvious. Name and organisation, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Anima Singh. I'm a second-year student from Hindu College, Delhi University. And I would like to take this opportunity to first of all appreciate the efforts of the Indian government to evacuate all the students who are senior to us or also of our age from Ukraine. And I would also like to appreciate the efforts of UK government, because UK for higher education is a breeding ground for Indian students, and it has been very conducive as regards to that. But as a student, a question always bothers me, and that is this. Between geographical realities, the historical connectedness, and the present share of values like democracy, which of these three take precedence when a country is thinking about diplomacy, when the country is thinking about foreign policy decisions and policy making in general? Thank you so much.
Dr. Jaishankar. Home team first.
Well, look, I think it's actually a mix of all of them. It's often situation specific as well, but all of them count. You know, the fact is, when we look at the world, what we believe in, what we practice at home, what we are comfortable with guides our response to what's happening in the world. But again, as I said earlier, you know, it's a human trait to relate much more strongly to people you feel closer to. So their geography is a factor. Again, if there are societies with which there's you know, a lot of connectedness before, where you have a shared history, there's a bonding which comes with that. And the interesting part of international relations is really how, you know, among the 200 odd countries of the world, this combination of values and beliefs and interests and bonding, you know, how that plays out. And that is really what makes it, in many ways, such a complex profession, which is my nice way of saying you need diplomats and foreign ministers.
Liz Truss.
Well, thank you. And we're absolutely delighted that the number of Indian students in the UK is increasing rapidly. Am I right in thinking it's doubled, High Commissioner, in the last year? And we really welcome Indian students to the United Kingdom and the huge contribution they make. Of course, all of these factors need to be considered. And one thing I always reflect on in the jobs I do in government is what is achievable and not achievable. So where can I make a difference? Where is there an opportunity? And where is the time right to do something? Because we're talking at the moment about the India-UK relationship. I really feel now is a very good time where we have a strong coincidence of our interests, where there is a clear agenda of things we can do that are going to benefit our population. So it's also about choosing the right time to do the right thing, as well as the values that have to underpin everything we do.
Time for one final question, I think. A very brief one. I see someone at the back as well, if I remembered rightly. Yes, but somebody's waving at me by the door. Name and organisation, please.
Hi, Alistair Powell from Reuters News. Foreign Secretary obviously mentioned reducing reliance on Russian oil and gas. I mean, what do you make of the news that India is seeking to buy huge amounts of Russian oil at a very steep discount? You must be quite disappointed that something goes so contrary to your sanctions programme.
Well, I've outlined the UK's approach to sanctions and the fact that we are ending our dependence on Russian oil by the end of this year, but we're also looking to achieve a timetable with the G7. We've got a meeting of the G7 later this week. I think it's very important, though, that we respect other countries' decisions about the issues that they face. India is a sovereign nation. I'm not going to tell India what to do. What I've said is, as a member of the UK government that has signed up to the Budapest Memorandum, I feel a strong responsibility on behalf of the United Kingdom to take all the action we can to support the people of Ukraine. But that is not the same as going around telling other countries what to do.
Final question.
May I just add a word there?
Of course.
It's interesting because we've seen for some time what looks almost like a campaign on this issue. Now, I was just reading a report today that in the month of March, Europe has bought, I think, 15% more oil and gas from Russia than it did the month before. If you look at the major buyers of oil and gas from Russia, I think you'd find most of them are in Europe. We ourselves get the bulk of our energy supplies from the Middle East, about 7.5%, 8% of our oil from the US. In the past, maybe less than 1% from Russia. When oil prices go up, I think it's natural for countries to go out into the market and look for what are good deals for their people. But I am pretty sure if we wait 2 or 3 months and actually look at who are the big buyers of Russian gas and oil, I suspect the list won't be very different from what it used to be, and I suspect we won't be in the top 10 on that list.
Foreign Secretary.
I think there's also a broader point here, which is, I've said this about Europe, that over a number of years, Europe prioritized cheap gas, cheap goods over looking at our long-term security. And we didn't do enough when Putin invaded Crimea. We didn't do enough to involve ourselves in the Minsk agreements. And we are now seeing the result of that. And necessarily, dependency on energy or dependency on technology takes time to address. So we're now removing Huawei from UK telecoms networks, but that takes time. We're reducing and eliminating our dependence on Russian oil and gas, and that takes time. And that is also true of other countries. And the important thing for me is that the G7 set a timetable to end that dependency and send a strong signal in the markets. But, to say that, years of policy that we have just been through, you can suddenly change it overnight. I mean, there have been some pretty remarkable changes. Germany has changed its entire energy and defense policy as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. And we need to keep doing that. I think the biggest danger at the moment is that we let our foot off the gas on sanctions, and we can't do that. We need to continue to put the pressure on Putin. We need to continue to supply the weapons into Ukraine. And we need to make absolutely sure that we don't have a rerun of Minsk, that we make sure that the sanctions are kept on, even in the event of a ceasefire, even in the event of a withdrawal of troops, because it's only when we get lasting peace that this situation will finally have been resolved.